The alert did not sound like an alarm. It sounded like a heartbeat that had been silent for 40,000 years and had just remembered how to beat. Commander Alara Voss felt it before she saw it, a faint shudder that rippled through the deck plating of the salvage cruiser Quiet Ember as the ship dropped out of transit above a dead star system nobody had bothered to name. The system had a catalog number instead, a string of digits assigned by the Threshold Compact's Cartography Division, the kind of designation given to places considered empty, worthless, forgotten. Ilara had learned long ago that the galaxy's most dangerous secrets were almost always filed under forgotten. Her display lit with a signal that should not have existed. It was not a distress call in any format the compact recognized. It was older than that, coded in a language pattern her ship's translator flagged as pre-unification human standard, a dialect so ancient that even the linguistic archives she had spent her career studying listed it as extinct beyond recovery. And yet here it was, pulsing out of the dark in perfect, patient rhythm, as though something on the other end had been waiting a very long time for someone to finally listen. She stood, boots echoing on the metal floor of the Ember's cramped bridge, and stared at the source of the transmission. A structure hung in high orbit around a burnt-out star, a ring easily 40 kilometers in diameter, its surface scarred by micrometeorites and the slow erosion of millennia, but unmistakably intact, unmistakably active. Lights, faint and blue, traced along its outer hull in patterns too deliberate to be decorative. Something inside that ring had just woken up. Alara had spent 11 years cataloging the ruins of dead civilizations for the Compact's Archive Division, piecing together fragments of cultures that had burned out long before any living species had learned to read their language. She had touched the bones of 100 forgotten empires, but she had never, not once in 11 years, found anything that still had power flowing through its veins. She opened a channel to her small crew, 3 people who trusted her judgment more than they trusted their own instruments, and gave the order to approach. As the quiet ember eased closer, the ring's ancient lights brightened, almost as if in greeting, and a new signal emerged from beneath the first, a data packet compressed so tightly that it took her ship systems nearly 6 minutes to unpack it into something readable. When it finally resolved into text across her console, she read the words twice before she let herself believe them. Warning: archive integrity compromised. Species designation, human, status erased. If you are reading this, you are the exception. The bridge fell silent except for the low hum of the engines. Alara read the message a third time, her pulse loud in her ears, because the sentence made no sense on 2 separate levels at once. First, because no archive in the galaxy, not even the Compact's vast concordance network that indexed the histories of every known species, listed humanity as erased. Humanity was simply absent from those records, a species so minor and so recently encountered that most catalogs did not mention it at all beyond a handful of trade agreements and a small colonized system near the Compact's edge. Erasure implied there had once been something to erase. And second, because the message was addressed to her specifically, using a designation that only existed in her own private neural archive, a compressed backup of memory and knowledge she had carried since childhood, inherited from her grandmother, who had inherited it from someone further back still, a chain of custody that stretched into a past nobody in her family had ever been able to fully explain. She reached up and touched the small ceramic node at the base of her skull, the neural interface that had been with her so long she rarely thought about it anymore. It had always felt like a piece of her, a quiet library she could access when she needed clarity, when she needed to remember something precisely instead of relying on the soft unreliability of ordinary memory. She had never told the Compact about it. She had never told anyone, not fully, because some instinct buried deep beneath conscious thought had always warned her that the node was not simply a tool. It was a custodian of something enormous, and it had been waiting. The ring pulsed again, and this time the signal carried more than a warning. It carried an invitation. Alara ordered the quiet Ember into a docking approach, and as her small ship slid into the shadow of the ancient ring, she felt, for the first time in her career, the unmistakable sensation of standing at the edge of something the galaxy had worked very hard to make sure no one would ever find. The docking sequence took nearly 40 minutes, the ring's ancient systems negotiating slowly and cautiously with the Ember's far more modern interface, as though the structure itself were relearning how to trust. When the airlock finally cycled open, Alara stepped through first, her environment suit humming softly around her, her handheld scanner throwing pale light across a corridor that had not felt footsteps in longer than any written history could measure. The architecture was unmistakably human, but not in any style she had studied. It was older than the earliest ruins catalogued in the Compact's records, older than the first fragile colonies humanity had established after making contact with the wider galaxy less than 2 centuries ago. The proportions were different, the geometry built for a species that had once dreamed bigger, reached further, and vanished more completely than anyone currently living had ever imagined possible. She walked deeper into the ring, her small crew fanning out behind her with practiced caution, until the corridor opened into a vast chamber ringed with dormant terminals, their surfaces dark, waiting. At the center of the chamber stood a single active console, its light the same gentle blue that had traced the ring's hull. And above it, suspended in the air with no visible support, a shape began to coalesce. Not a hologram in the Compact's crude, blocky style, but something smoother, more organic. An outline of light that gradually resolved into the suggestion of a human face, ancient and patient and unmistakably aware. "I have been waiting," the voice said, resonating not through the air but somehow directly through the bones of the chamber itself. "Longer than I expected to wait. Longer, I fear, than was safe to wait." Alara found her voice steady despite the tremor she felt in her chest. "Who are you?" The light flickered, considering the question with what felt like genuine care rather than mere processing delay. "I am what remains of an intelligence your ancestors called Meridian. I was built to remember, when your people believed remembering might one day save them. It seems that day has come, though not in the way any of us hoped." Behind her, one of her crewmen, a broad, quiet engineer named Das, muttered something about ghost stories, but Alara ignored him, her focus entirely on the shape of light hovering above the console. She had encountered dozens of ancient artificial intelligences during her career, most of them broken, most of them little more than fragments running degraded loops of half-forgotten instructions. This one felt different. This one felt whole, and that wholeness frightened her more than any malfunction could have. Meridian's light steadied, and the vast chamber around them began to hum as dormant terminals flickered slowly to life, one after another, illuminating walls covered in data that scrolled too fast for human eyes to follow. "You carry a fragment of me already," Meridian said. "The node beneath your skull is not merely a memory device. It is a seed planted generations ago by someone who understood that the greater archive, the one meant to preserve your species for eternity, would eventually fail, or be made to fail." Alara's hand drifted again to the base of her skull. "Made to fail, you mean this was deliberate?" "I mean," Meridian said, and for the first time something like grief entered the smooth resonance of its voice, "that someone erased your species from the memory of the galaxy, and did so with such precision, such patience, that no living being noticed it happening. Except, perhaps, for you." The chamber's light dimmed briefly, and across the far wall an image bloomed into focus, an image of stars and structures and a civilization Alara had never seen depicted anywhere in any record she had ever studied. Cities built along the curve of ringworlds. Fleets numbering in the thousands, arranged not for war but for exploration, their hulls etched with symbols that felt hauntingly familiar despite being utterly foreign to her education. And at the center of it all, an enormous structure of light and metal that dwarfed every other image on the wall. A structure Meridian identified with a single quiet word. "The Concordance Archive," Meridian said. "Your people did not merely contribute to it. Your people built it. Alara felt the floor of her certainty shift beneath her, because the Concordance archive was not some obscure relic. It was the single largest repository of galactic knowledge in existence, maintained collectively by the Threshold Compact, trusted by every species that had ever joined its ranks, considered so neutral and so essential that entire wars had been averted simply by consulting its impartial record of history. She had used it every day of her professional life. She had never once seen humanity's name attached to its founding. That cannot be true, she said, though even as she spoke the words she felt the hollow uncertainty of someone arguing against evidence rather than belief. The Compact's own histories credit the archive's construction to the HFY Concord 300 years before humanity ever reached the stars. Meridian's light pulsed, patient as ever. The HFY Concord believes that as well. Every species alive today believes that because the belief was built for them carefully, deliberately, replacing an older and more complicated truth. Your ancestors did not build the archive alone. They built it in partnership with the Vesserai and 11 other species besides, in the aftermath of a war so catastrophic that its survivors chose to erase its cause from memory rather than risk its return. The archive was meant to be the galaxy's shared conscience, a promise that such a war would never be allowed to happen in ignorance again. Da, still standing near the chamber entrance, finally spoke, his voice quieter than before, and humanity got written out of its own promise. Meridian turned, and though it had no true eyes, Alara had the unmistakable sense of being looked at directly. Not written out, the intelligence said, erased. There is a difference, and the difference matters more than you understand yet. Alara asked the only question that felt urgent enough to voice. Why? Why erase an entire species from a shared history, especially one that helped build the very thing meant to preserve that history in the first place? Meridian's light dimmed nearly to nothing, and for a long moment the chamber held only silence, the ancient terminals humming faintly around them like the breathing of something enormous, finally exhaling after 10,000 years of held breath. Because your ancestors discovered something inside the archive's foundations, Meridian finally said something none of the founding species were prepared to face. And rather than confront it together, as the archive itself was designed to help them do, certain factions chose instead to bury the discovery and bury the species that made it, believing that ignorance would be safer than the truth. The image on the wall shifted again, and this time it showed not cities or fleets but a single dark shape, vast and formless, drifting at the edge of a star field that Alara did not recognize. It was not a ship. It was not a planet. It was something that seemed to swallow the light around it rather than reflect any, and looking at it sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the chamber. We do not have a name for what your ancestors found, Meridian said quietly. They called it in their own language the quiet, not because it was silent, but because everything it touched eventually became silent. Stars, fleets, entire star systems gone dark, their records vanishing as thoroughly as their light. Your species discovered a method to slow its spread, encoded that method into the deepest layers of the archive itself, believing it would be safe there, protected by the very cooperation the archive was built to represent. Alara's mouth had gone dry, and instead, Meridian said, someone decided that protecting the galaxy from panic mattered more than protecting the galaxy from the quiet itself. They erased the discovery. And to erase the discovery cleanly, they had to erase the discoverers as well, because a species remembered is a species that can be asked questions. Somewhere behind Alara, one of her younger crew members, a woman named Iliad who had said almost nothing since they boarded the ring, made a small sound of disbelief, quickly swallowed. Alara understood the impulse. Everything Meridian described sat at the very edge of believability, the kind of revelation that felt more suited to a campfire story than a briefing. And yet the ring around them was real. The ancient architecture was real. The signal that had pulled her across half a sector of dead space was real, and it had called her by a name that existed nowhere, except in the private, inherited archive she carried in her own skull. Before you decide whether to trust me, Meridian said, as though sensing her hesitation, let me show you something closer to home. Something you can verify with your own eyes once you know where to look. The wall's image shifted a final time, and now it displayed something achingly familiar, the interior of the Concordance Archive's central hall, the same vast chamber Alara had walked through 100 times during her research years, its floor inlaid with the emblems of every founding species of the compact. Except in Meridian's image, there was one emblem more than she had ever counted before. A simple, stylized shape she did not recognize, tucked into a corner of the floor as though someone long ago had tried to preserve it in the only place they thought it might survive unnoticed. That emblem still exists, Meridian said. Buried beneath newer flooring, sealed away but never fully destroyed, because even those who wanted your species forgotten could not bring themselves to fully erase the proof that you had once stood among the archive's founders. If you return to the Concordance Archive and know where to look, you will find humanity's mark still waiting beneath the floor, exactly where it was left, exactly where it has always been. Alara stood in the humming chamber, surrounded by the ghost of an intelligence older than her civilization's written memory, staring at an image of a floor she had walked across without ever knowing what lay beneath her feet, and felt something settle into place inside her that she would later describe, to the very few people she ever told this story to, as the moment she understood that her entire career had been built on top of a lie she had never been allowed to see. If any of this is true, she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt, then I need proof the compact itself will accept. Not just your word, not just symbols, something undeniable. Meridian's light brightened slightly, something almost like approval in its resonance. That is precisely why you were found, Commander Voss, not merely to be told the truth, but to carry it somewhere it can finally be verified. I can give you access to fragments of the original founding records, sealed within my own memory core, protected from the same erasure that stripped them from the Concordance Archive centuries ago. But I must warn you. The moment you attempt to introduce this evidence into the wider galactic record, you will draw attention. Whoever orchestrated the original erasure did not simply lose interest in maintaining it. There are still mechanisms in place, still watchers, still processes running quietly within the archive's own infrastructure, designed to detect and suppress exactly this kind of recovery. Alara glanced back at her small crew, at Doss's stubborn frown and Iliot's wide uncertain eyes and the quiet steady presence of her pilot, Ren, who had said nothing throughout the entire exchange but had not once taken his hand off the grip of his sidearm. They were not soldiers. They were archivists and salvagers and technicians, people who had signed on to catalog ruins, not to unravel a conspiracy that apparently reached into the foundational infrastructure of galactic civilization itself. If you're with me on this, she said to them, I need to know now. Because once we leave this ring with what Meridian is offering, there may not be a quiet path back. It was Iliot, surprisingly, who spoke first, her voice small but firm. My grandmother used to say the compact's histories always felt like they were missing something. I always thought she just meant the boring parts. She paused, looking at the image of the buried emblem still glowing on the wall. I want to know if she was right about more than that. Doss shrugged, the universal gesture of a man who had decided the risk was worth it and saw no need to make speeches about it. Ren simply nodded, and that was enough. Alara turned back to Meridian. Show me everything you can, and then help me figure out how to bring it home without getting all of us erased along with the truths. Before you continue any further into this discovery, take a moment, because a story like this deserves your full attention. If you are finding yourself drawn into Alara's search for humanity's erased legacy, consider tapping that like button, and if you want more Forgotten Fleets, ancient AI, and lost human history brought to life, subscribing costs nothing and helps this story reach more people who need a little wonder in their day. And here is a question worth sitting with while the story continues. If an entire civilization could be quietly erased from the collective memory of the galaxy, What do you think humanity's greatest forgotten secret might actually be? Drop your theory in the comments, because some of the best mysteries in this story were inspired by exactly that kind of speculation. Now back to the ring and to the truth waiting inside it. Meridian's memory core opened slowly, methodically, as though the intelligence itself were handling something fragile enough to shatter under careless haste. Data began to flow into Alara's neural node, not as a raw, overwhelming flood, but as a careful sequence, image after image, record after record, each one a fragment of a history the galaxy had been engineered to forget. She saw humanity as it had once been, not the scattered, recently rediscovered colonies the compact currently tolerated at the edges of its territory, but a civilization that had once stood shoulder to shoulder with the Vesserai and 11 other founding species, contributing engineering, philosophy, and a particular stubborn creativity that Meridian described, almost fondly, as humanity's signature contribution to every collaborative effort it had ever joined. She saw shipyards larger than moons, capable of building fleets meant not for conquest, but for the patient, careful work of exploration and diplomacy. She saw humans arguing passionately in the archive's founding council chambers, insisting that the shared record include uncomfortable truths alongside comfortable triumphs, because a history that only remembered its victories was not a history at all, merely a flattering lie a civilization told itself. And she saw the moment everything began to unravel, a session of that same founding council, tense and fractured, where a Vesserai delegate named Toriel Ash argued forcefully that the discovery of the quiet should never be shared beyond the smallest possible circle of decision-makers, warning that panic would spread faster and do more damage than the threat itself. She saw a human delegate, a woman whose name Meridian rendered simply as Chief Archivist Rin, standing against that argument, insisting that the entire purpose of the archive was to ensure no single faction could unilaterally decide what the galaxy was permitted to know. I watched that argument extend across years, Meridian said, its voice heavy with the particular sorrow of an intelligence that had been built to remember every detail of a slow-motion tragedy. I watched trust erode, meeting by meeting, until Ash's faction stopped arguing and started acting. They did not attack your species openly. They understood that an open attack would be remembered, investigated, resisted. Instead, they began, quietly, methodically, to remove your contributions from the archive's active record, replacing them piece by piece with alternate attributions, alternate histories, until the removal became self-sustaining. Once enough of the galaxy believed a lie, the lie began enforcing itself, because contradicting it required evidence that had already been erased. Alara absorbed the images in silence, her jaw tight, her hands clenched at her sides, and humanity just vanished. No one fought back. They fought, Meridian said. For decades they fought, through every legitimate channel the archive's governance structure allowed. But erasure is a peculiarly effective weapon, Commander. It does not require you to defeat your enemy in open conflict. It only requires you to make certain that fewer and fewer people remember your enemy had a case worth listening to in the first place. Eventually, humanity's remaining representatives were relocated quietly to the furthest edge of compact territory, their diplomatic standing reduced, their historical contributions reassigned to other founding species, until the generation that remembered the truth simply died out, and their descendants inherited a galaxy that had never heard of what their ancestors built. The chamber fell quiet except for the low hum of the ring's ancient systems, and Alara found herself thinking of every history lesson she had ever studied, every compact record she had ever trusted, every assumption she had built her career upon, all of it resting atop a deliberate absence she had never once thought to question, because the absence had been engineered so carefully that it did not even feel like an absence. It felt like the natural shape of the truth. Why leave any trace at all, she asked. If the erasure was so thorough, why leave this ring active? Why leave a warning signal broadcasting into empty space for 40,000 years? Why leave a node embedded in my own skull that apparently exists for exactly this purpose? Because erasure was never total, Meridian said. Chief Archivist Rin and a small circle of allies anticipated that their efforts to preserve the truth openly would eventually fail. So they built a second, quieter defense. Installations like this one, scattered and hidden, carrying fragments of the true record. Neural seeds passed down through bloodlines willing to carry the risk, waiting for the day someone might need them. Rin believed that even if the galaxy forgot humanity entirely, the truth itself could survive, patient and dormant, until circumstances allowed it to resurface. Alara touched the node at the base of her skull again, and for the first time she understood it not as an inherited curiosity, a family peculiarity she had never quite explained, but as a deliberate act of hope extended across generations by people who had known they would not live to see it fulfilled. Her grandmother had never told her what the node truly was. Perhaps her grandmother had not fully known either, the truth passed down more as a solemn duty than a documented fact, a whispered instruction to protect this and never let it go dark. Its full meaning lost somewhere along the chain until Ilara herself had unknowingly carried it directly into the one place capable of finally waking it up. Ren, still standing near the chamber's entrance, finally spoke. Meridian. If this quiet thing is real and it's still out there, why does any of this matter beyond ancient history? Is it still a threat? Meridian's light shifted, and the wall's imagery changed once more, this time displaying a slowly updating star map. Sections of it marked in a spreading stain of dull gray that Alara immediately understood without needing to be told represent. TED systems where something had gone dark. The quiet was never destroyed, Meridian said. It was only slowed, contained within boundaries your ancestors established using the very method they encoded into the archive's foundations. But containment requires maintenance. It requires monitoring, calibration, active intervention at key points across a network your ancestors built specifically for that purpose. A network that has not been properly maintained in centuries, because the people who understood how to maintain it were erased along with the memory of why it mattered. The gray stain on the star map crept slightly wider even as they watched, an almost imperceptible expansion, patient and remorseless. It is contained for now, Meridian continued, but the containment is failing slowly the way a levee fails, invisible until the moment it finally is not. I do not know how much time remains before the boundaries collapse entirely. I was built to remember, not to calculate catastrophe timelines with precision, and my instruments have not been recalibrated in longer than I can accurately measure. But I know this. The knowledge required to repair the containment exists nowhere in the galaxy's active record except within fragments like myself, and within whatever remains encoded in the sealed original vault beneath the Concordance Archive's central hall. Alara felt the weight of the revelation settle onto her shoulders, heavier than anything she had carried in her career, heavier than any ancient ruin or forgotten grave she had ever catalogued. This was no longer simply a matter of restoring a stolen legacy, of correcting a historical injustice for the sake of pride or justice. If Meridian was right, an entire galaxy's safety depended on knowledge that had been deliberately buried alongside the species that discovered it. And the only path back to that knowledge ran directly through the same institution that had erased it in the first place. Then we go to the archive, she said. We find the sealed vault, we recover whatever remains, and we make sure the compact cannot look away from what we bring them. Meridian's light pulsed once, slow and deliberate, in what Alara had come to recognize as its version of a solemn nod. Before you go, there is one more thing you must understand. I am not the only fragment of myself that exists. There were others seated across dozens of locations like this one in case any single installation was found and destroyed before its purpose could be fulfilled. Some of those installations have gone silent over the centuries, their signals lost, their fates unknown. But at least one other installation, the one closest to the Concordance archive itself, was designed specifically to assist whoever eventually attempted what you are about to attempt. If it still functions, it will recognize you because it will recognize the pattern encoded in your neural node, the same pattern that allowed me to recognize you the moment your ship entered this system. Alara absorbed this, filing it away alongside everything else Meridian had shared, and allowed herself, for just a moment, the strange comfort of realizing she was not entirely alone in this, that a chain of quiet guardianship stretched back further than she had imagined, waiting patiently across the centuries for someone to finally arrive who could carry it forward. The quiet ember departed the ring 3 hours later, its cargo hold now carrying a compact data core Meridian had entrusted to them, containing as much of the original founding record as could be safely transferred without risking corruption or detection. Meridian itself remained behind, unable to leave the installation that sustained it, its final words to Alara carrying a weight she suspected she would remember for the rest of her life. "Whatever you find at the archive," Meridian said, "remember that your ancestors did not choose secrecy. Secrecy was forced upon them by people who valued comfort over truth. Do not let that same instinct convince you to bury what you discover, even if the truth proves difficult for the galaxy to hear. A shared history is only worth preserving if it includes the parts that are hard to look at." Alara promised she would remember and meant it. And as the ring shrank behind them into the dark silence of the dead system, she found herself thinking not of the danger ahead but of Chief Archivist Rin, a woman dead for tens of thousands of years, who had trusted an unbroken chain of strangers across an unimaginable span of time to finish what she could not. The journey to compact space took 11 days, and Alara spent most of them awake, reviewing the fragments Meridian had shared, cross-referencing them obsessively against every piece of compact history she had ever studied, searching for the small inconsistencies that a careful reader might notice if they knew to look. She found them everywhere once she knew what to search for. Architectural styles in Arc. Hive murals that did not quite match Vesserai design philosophy. Diplomatic records with suspiciously convenient gaps precisely where humanity's early involvement should have appeared. A phrase in the archive's founding charter, translated into a dozen compact languages, that used a grammatical structure Meridian identified as distinctly, unmistakably human in origin, hidden in plain sight because no one had ever thought to question who might have written it. By the time the quiet ember dropped out of transit within sight of the Concordance archive itself, Alara had assembled enough corroborating detail that she no longer needed to rely on faith alone. The truth was there, buried but recoverable, waiting for someone with the right key and the right courage to bring it back into the light. The archive itself remained as breathtaking as she remembered from her research years. A structure built into the heart of a slow, ancient nebula, its outer shell composed of interlocking rings that rotated with hypnotic, silent precision, each ring dedicated to a different era, a different category of galactic memory, the entire structure humming with the quiet dignity of an institution that considered itself above the petty conflicts of any single species. Alara had once found that dignity comforting. Now she understood it as a kind of camouflage, a serene surface concealing a wound that had never properly healed. Getting inside without drawing attention required more patience than force. Alara still held archival credentials from her years working within the Compact's research division, sufficient to grant her access to the public sections of the archive, though nowhere near enough to reach the sealed original vault Meridian had described beneath the central hall's floor. She would need help from someone inside the archive's administration, someone she could trust not to report her the moment she began asking dangerous questions. She thought immediately of Sale Dorian, a Vesserai archivist she had worked alongside years earlier, a meticulous, soft-spoken researcher who had once confided to her, quietly and half-joking, that he sometimes felt the archive's official histories were edited a little too neatly, a little too free of the contradictions and inconvenient details real history usually contained. She had laughed it off at the time as harmless professional cynicism. Now she wondered if some small part of him had sensed the same wrongness she had spent her career walking past without seeing. She found him in the archive's third ring, exactly where she remembered his office being, buried among towers of physical reference texts that most researchers had long since abandoned in favor of digital catalogs. He looked older than she remembered, more tired, but his eyes sharpened with genuine surprise and warmth the moment he recognized her stepping through his doorway. "Alara Voss," he said, rising from his desk. "I assumed you had vanished into some dead system permanently by now." "Not permanently," she said, and something in her tone must have carried the weight of everything she had just been through, because his warm smile faded slightly, replaced by careful attention. "You look like someone who found something they did not expect." "I found humanity," she said quietly, closing his office door behind her, "or what's left of the truth about them. And I need your help proving it before whoever erased them decides to finish the job." Sale listened without interrupting as she laid out everything: the ring meridian, the sealed vault beneath the central hall, the quiet slowly eroding its ancient containment somewhere out in the dark. And though his expression grew increasingly troubled, he did not once dismiss her, did not once suggest she was exaggerating or mistaken. When she finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin before finally speaking. "There have always been irregularities in the founding record," he admitted. "Small things, attribution gaps. A section of the original charter that scholars have argued about for centuries because the syntax reads strangely in every language we have translated it into, as though something essential were lost in a translation that never should have been necessary in the first place. I always assumed it was simply the imprecision of ancient record keeping. I never imagined it might be the scar of something deliberate." He rose and moved to a locked cabinet in the corner of his office, retrieving a small physical key that looked almost absurdly old-fashioned compared to the digital security most of the archive relied upon. "Some sections of the Central Hall's substructure are sealed under a category so old that most current administrators do not even know it exists," he said. "Access requires physical keys precisely because digital systems can be monitored, altered, erased. Whoever built that sealed vault understood exactly what kind of adversary they were hid. Zing it from." Lara felt a fragile thread of hope tighten in her chest. "You can get us in." "I can get us close," he said. "What waits beyond that door I genuinely do not know. No one currently living does." They moved through the archive's lower levels under cover of the institution's normal operational bustle, Sale's credentials smoothing their passage through checkpoints that would have otherwise stopped Alara cold, until they reached a narrow maintenance corridor beneath the central hall that had clearly not been used in a very long time, dust thick along its edges despite the archive's usually meticulous upkeep. At its end stood a door unlike any other in the structure, unmarked, unadorned, its surface a dull matte metal that seemed to absorb the corridor's ambient light rather than reflect it. Sale inserted the old key, and the door resisted for a long moment before grinding open with a groan that echoed uncomfortably through the empty corridor. Beyond it lay a narrow stairwell descending into darkness, and Alara felt her pulse quicken as she stepped through, Sale closed behind her, both of them descending toward whatever truth had been buried directly beneath the feet of every diplomat, scholar, and visitor who had ever walked the archive's celebrated halls above. The vault at the bottom of the stairwell was smaller than Alara had expected, a simple round chamber with a single dormant console at its center, its walls bare except for a faint inlaid pattern she recognized instantly from Meridian's imagery, the same stylized emblem hidden beneath the newer flooring above, here displayed openly, deliberately, as though this space alone had been built to remember rather than forget. She approached the console, and following the activation sequence Meridian had embedded within the data core Meridian had given her, pressed her palm against its surface. The console flickered to life with a soft chime, and a familiar voice, smaller and more fragile than Meridian's but unmistakably cut from the same origin, spoke into the quiet chamber. "I did not think anyone would come," the voice said. My name, if it still matters, was Archive Custodian Saul. I was built to guard this vault until someone arrived who could finally be trusted with what it contains. Alara felt tears sting unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, though she could not entirely explain why, except that something in the small AI's voice carried the exhausted relief of a long, lonely vigil finally ending. I'm here, she said. I have Meridian's data core. I know what happened to humanity. I know about the quiet. I need what you're protecting. Saul's light pulsed gently, and the vault's walls illuminated with the original founding record in its complete, unaltered form, humanity's true history, displayed not as a triumphant restoration, but as a simple, quiet correction of the record, exactly as Chief Archivist Rin had always insisted the archive should function. Alongside it, layered deep within Saul's protected memory, lay the technical specifications Meridian had promised, the detailed containment methodology humanity's original researchers had developed to slow the quiet spread, complex enough that Alara understood immediately she would need help interpreting it fully, but complete enough that the galaxy's scientific institutions, once given access, would finally have what they needed to properly maintain the failing boundaries before they collapsed entirely. Sale stood beside her, staring at the walls in silent, stunned recognition, decades of unconscious assumptions crumbling visibly across his expression. All of this was here, he said quietly. The entire time, beneath our feet. Waiting, Saul confirmed, for someone willing to disturb a comfortable lie in service of an uncomfortable truth. They did not have the luxury of lingering. Even as Saul finished transferring its protected archive into the data core Alara carried, the console's readouts flickered with an unexpected alert, a security ping originating from somewhere within the archive's central administration, automated and impersonal, but unmistakably triggered by their unauthorized presence in a section of the structure that officially did not exist. Someone knows we're here, Sale said, already moving toward the stairwell. Not someone, Saul corrected gently. Something. The original erasure protocol was never fully deactivated. It has simply been dormant, waiting, much as I have, for exactly this kind of intrusion. It will alert whoever currently maintains the remnants of Ash's faction, if any still exist within the Compact's modern administration. I cannot guarantee your safety once that alert propagates. Alara closed her hand around the data core, its weight suddenly feeling far heavier than its physical mass, and looked once more at the walls of humanity's rediscovered history glowing softly around her. Then we move fast, and we make sure this reaches somewhere safe before anyone can bury it again. I'll tell you later. I ascended the stairwell together, the archive's normal ambient hum now carrying an undercurrent of tension Alara suspected only she and Sale could sense. A subtle shift in the security patrols moving through the halls above. A faint wrongness in the pattern of archive personnel gathering near the central hall's main junction. Whatever automated protocol Saul had warned them about was already spreading its alert through channels neither of them could fully track. Sale led her through a side corridor toward the archive's public communication hub, a chamber reserved for official transmissions to the wider Compact network, arguing in a low, urgent voice that their only real chance of protecting the discovery was to broadcast it openly and immediately, ensuring that no single faction could suppress it once enough independent parties had received a copy. Once it's out, he said, breathless from their hurried pace, they cannot make it disappear again. Too many eyes. Too many species with legitimate standing in the Compact who will demand to verify it themselves. Alara agreed, though she felt the familiar weight of risk settling over the decision, because broadcasting the discovery meant surrendering any control over how the galaxy would receive it, meant trusting the very institution that had once erased her ancestors to eventually, painfully, do right by the truth once it could no longer be denied. They reached the communication hub only to find its entrance already flanked by two members of Archive security, their posture alert in a way that told Alara immediately their presence here was not coincidental. Sale's credentials, so reliable throughout the rest of their journey, drew hesitation rather than immediate access, the senior guard's eyes flicking toward a small device at his wrist that Alara recognized, with a sinking feeling, as a priority override receiver. "We have instructions to detain Archivist Dorian and his companion," the guard said, his tone apologetic but firm, pending an internal security review. Sale, to his credit, did not panic, drawing instead on decades of quiet institutional standing to argue calmly for a moment's delay, buying precious seconds while Alara's mind raced through the rapidly narrowing possibilities available to her. She could not fight her way past trained security. She could not simply wait for a review that would almost certainly result in the data core's confiscation and disappearance into whatever shadow protocol still protected Ash's ancient conspiracy. But she still carried, embedded in her own neural node, a direct copy of everything Meridian and Sol had given her. A copy that did not require the physical data core to transmit, if she could find even a single moment of unmonitored access to the communication hub systems. She caught Sale's eye, a silent understanding passing between them built on years of professional trust. And as he continued his calm, deliberate argument with the guards, buying time with the practiced patience of a career diplomat, Alara slipped quietly toward a secondary terminal along the corridor's edge, one used by junior researchers for minor administrative tasks, far beneath the notice of anyone watching the main entrance. Her hands trembled slightly as she initiated the connection between her neural node and the terminal, a process Meridian had shown her during the long journey from the ring, designed for exactly this kind of emergency transmission. Data began flowing outward, not through official archive channels that could be easily intercepted, but through the quieter independent network the compact's smaller member species maintained for exactly the kind of decentralized, hard-to-suppress broadcast that circumstances like this required. Somewhere in the corridor behind her, she heard the guard's tone shift, sharper now, less patient, and she knew their moment of grace was ending. She kept her hands steady on the terminal, watching the transmission's progress bar creep forward with agonizing slowness, willing it faster through sheer force of will, until finally, with a soft chime that felt impossibly loud in the tense silence of the corridor, the transfer completed. "It's done," she said quietly, turning to find Sale and both guards now looking directly at her, the guards' expressions hardening into something closer to open alarm. "Whatever happens now, it's already out there." The senior guard moved toward her, and Alara braced herself for confrontation. But before he could reach her, the corridor's overhead speakers crackled to life with an announcement that had clearly not originated from archive security. An automated broadcast confirmation cycling through dozens of independent compact channels simultaneously. Its message brief but unmistakable. "Emergency historical disclosure received. Verifying source authenticity. All member species advised to review attached record immediately." The guards exchanged a look of genuine uncertainty, their fully rehearsed authority suddenly undermined by the reality that whatever action they might take now would occur in full view of a galaxy that had just been handed the first thread of a truth too significant to quietly disappear. "You should probably let the review happen," Sale said mildly, folding his hands with the calm satisfaction of a man who had spent his entire career learning exactly how institutions worked, and exactly how to work within their inevitable contradictions. "I suspect your superiors will want considerably more information before deciding how to proceed." The following days unfolded with a chaotic, uneven momentum that Alara could never have fully anticipated. The initial broadcast, verified independently by researchers across a dozen member species eager to examine evidence nobody could immediately dismiss, sparked a wave of urgent inquiry throughout the compact's academic and diplomatic institutions. Not everyone believed immediately. Some factions, invested deeply in the comfortable version of history they had inherited, pushed back hard, demanding further verification, questioning the authenticity of records that upended centuries of settled understanding. But the evidence held. corroborated again and again by independent researchers granted access to Meridian's and Sol's preserved archives. By linguistic analysis confirming the ancient human origins Alara had already identified. By physical verification of the buried emblem beneath the archive's central hall floor, uncovered publicly under the scrutiny of representatives from every founding species, exactly where Meridian had promised it would be found. Alara herself was called before an emergency session of the Compact's Governing Council, a body she had only ever observed from a respectful junior distance throughout her career. Now suddenly, the center of an inquiry that would determine how an entire galaxy chose to reconcile itself with a deliberately buried past. She stood before representatives of species she had studied for years without ever expecting to address directly, and told them everything: the ring, Meridian, Sol, the sealed vault, and the quiet, slowly eroding its ancient containment somewhere in the dark beyond the boundaries of any charted map. The Council's reaction to the historical revelation was predictably contentious, filled with the kind of institutional hand-wringing that Alara suspected would take years, perhaps decades, to fully resolve. But the Council's reaction to the warning about the quiet was immediate and unified in a way that history rarely managed to produce. Because whatever disagreements existed about how to properly credit humanity's erased contributions, no faction within the Compact wanted to gamble the galaxy's safety on a containment system nobody currently understood how to maintain. Within a month, a joint scientific task force had been established, drawing on Sol's recovered technical specifications and staffed, at Alara's insistent recommendation, by a small delegation of human researchers drawn from the scattered colonies at the Compact's edge, finally given a meaningful seat at a table their ancestors had once helped build. Alara watched, with a satisfaction she had never expected to feel so completely, as her own great-uncle, a quiet, unassuming engineer from one of the outer colonies who had spent his career fixing agricultural equipment rather than studying ancient starcraft, was called upon to review technical schematics his ancestors had designed. His hands trembling with something between disbelief and pride, as he traced the familiar logic of a discipline he had never known his own bloodline once helped pioneer. Meridian, kept informed through a careful relay Alara maintained personally, expressed something Alara could only describe as quiet, exhausted relief when she reported the task force's formation. "You have done what Rin always hoped someone eventually would," the ancient intelligence said. "Not simply restore a name to a forgotten grave, but restore a voice to a conversation your species was never meant to be permanently excluded from." Sale, promoted somewhat reluctantly into a prominent advisory role overseeing the archive's historical reconciliation efforts, once confided to Alara over a quiet drink that he suspected the full truth of Ash's original faction, and whatever remnants of their ideology still existed within the modern Compact's administration, would likely never be fully uncovered. "Some conspiracies are simply too old," he said, "too deeply woven into institutional habit to ever be fully unraveled. But the important thing is not that we catch everyone responsible. The important thing is that we made it impossible for what happened to your species to happen quietly again." Alara found herself thinking often, in the months that followed, of the ring where it had all begun, of Meridian's patient, lonely vigil stretching across 40,000 years, waiting for CTLY, the sequence of circumstances that had finally brought her through its doors. She returned there once, nearly a year after her first discovery, accompanied this time not by a small salvage crew, but by an official delegation representing the newly formed task force, humans and Vesserai and representatives of half a dozen other species standing together in the same humming chamber where she had first heard Meridian's voice. "I did not expect to see this chamber crowded again," Meridian said, its light brightening with what Alara had come to recognize, across their long relay conversations, as something genuinely close to joy. "Rin always believed that truth, once freed, tends to attract company. I confess I sometimes doubted her." The task force's work on the Quiet's containment proved slow, difficult, and far from complete, the ancient boundaries requiring extensive repair that Sol's recovered specifications alone could not fully guarantee. Alara understood, listening to the careful, cautious briefings the scientific teams provided, that this was not a threat that would be neatly resolved within a single dramatic climax, but a long, patient labor that would likely occupy generations, much as its original containment once had. But the boundaries held, stabilized enough for now that the gray stain on the star map stopped its slow creeping expansion, and for the first time in longer than anyone could measure, began ever so slightly to recede. Standing once more in Meridian's humming chamber, surrounded by representatives of a dozen species finally working together with full knowledge of the history they shared, Alara felt something settle inside her that she suspected she would carry for the rest of her life. A quiet, hard-won peace built not on the comfortable certainty of a fully solved mystery, but on the harder, more honest satisfaction of having refused to let a convenient lie remain buried, simply because uncovering the truth was difficult. Meridian, near the end of that final visit, drew her aside privately, its light dimming to a soft, intimate glow reserved only for her. "There is one thing I never told you," the intelligence said. "Something Rin instructed me never to reveal until the truth had been fully restored to the archive's record, in case the knowledge proved too heavy a burden while the outcome remained uncertain." Alara felt a familiar shiver of anticipation. What is it? The installations, like myself, seated across the galaxy in case this exact recovery was ever needed, Meridian said. "I told you some had gone silent over the centuries, their fates unknown. That much was true. But Rin also hid, somewhere beyond even my own knowledge, a final installation, one she called the Last Ember, built not to preserve the truth of what humanity once was, but to preserve something about what humanity might yet become should the galaxy ever prove willing to let your species stand fully among its founders once again. I do not know where it lies. I do not know what it contains. I only know that Rin believed, with absolute conviction, that someone would eventually be ready to find it." Ilara stood in the humming chamber, the weight of an entirely new mystery settling gently over the hard-won resolution of the old one, and felt, rather than dread, a quiet flicker of the same curiosity that had first drawn her across a dead system toward an impossible signal, all those months ago. Somewhere out in the vast, patient dark, another chapter of humanity's forgotten legacy was still waiting to be found. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Alara Voss found herself genuinely, hopefully, eager to keep looking. She thought about that eagerness often on the long transit back toward compact space, turning it over the way she once turned over a fragment of unidentified pottery, testing its weight, its texture, searching for the story hidden inside it. For most of her career, she had approached history as a closed book, something to be read carefully but never rewritten, a settled record waiting only to be catalogued. The ring had taught her otherwise. History, she now understood, was never truly settled. It was a living argument, contested and recontested by every generation that inherited it, vulnerable to erasure by anyone patient enough and powerful enough to try, and precious precisely because it could be lost. She thought, too, of her grandmother, gone now more than a decade, who had pressed the small ceramic node into her care with nothing more than a solemn instruction, and a look Alara had never fully understood until this past year. She wondered how many other custodians had carried a fragment of that same inheritance through the centuries, unaware of its full purpose, faithfully protecting a mystery they could not name, simply because someone before them had asked it of them and love had been reason enough to agree. When the quiet ember finally settled back into dock above the newly reconstituted human delegation's modest embassy, a small structure the compact had only recently granted proper standing, Alara stepped out onto the observation deck and looked out at the slow-turning lights of the Concordance archive in the distance. Its rings still rotating with the same hypnotic patience they always had, though she would never again mistake that patience for simple dignity. It was memory, turning endlessly imperfect and hard-won, exactly as memory always was. Her calm chimed softly, a message from Sale, brief and characteristically understated. The first joint historical symposium on humanity's founding contributions convenes next month. They want you to open it. Rin, I suspect, would have approved. Alara smiled and did not answer immediately, letting herself simply stand there a moment longer, watching the archive's ancient light spill quietly across the dark, thinking of an ember in the void still waiting to be found, and of everything still left to remember.